On a summer night in 1939, the citizens of Montreal went out to see a movie picture featuring themselves and their mayor.
The royal route winds through streets that have withstood the onslaught of the centuries, streets that have heard the battle cries of conquest and defeat. Now comes the city's official moment. The royal car at the head of a long procession arrives at the city hall. Crowds pressing in behind the king and queen hold up the mayor's car, but the way is cleared and his worship arrives to guide the monarchs up the long flight of steps into the city hall. Mayor Houde gallantly offers his arm to the queen and the royal party ascends into the building. There, amid impressive ceremony, their majesties will be officially welcomed and will sign their names in Montreal's Golden Book.
He was dancing with the queen and he was telling her jokes. Now, I've seen the queen on many occasions, and when you are in royalty, you are very sedate and you don't do too much smiling. But that night, I never saw the queen once closing her lips. She was smiling the whole night and dancing with Camillien Houde, and she had the most wonderful time of her life.
1 year later, when the Queen inquired after the health of Mayor Houde, she was told that he was being held at the pleasure of their majesties, and so he was. He had been arrested on the steps of City Hall for advocating civil disobedience. When he was released, it was to a hero's welcome. For 4 decades, he was the personification of the spirit of a great city. To some, he was a drunk, a charlatan, a traitor. To others, he was a master politician, a martyr, a man of greatness. His strength came from the little man of Montreal, and that little man was perhaps best symbolized by the great Montreal entertainer, Gratien Gélinas.
Well, you see, there are two kinds of political figure. The serious one, who are powerful, but stern, more or less. But with him it was different. He was a man who was powerful but gay. One of those persons which you meet, you see, and you begin by smiling.
His strength came not only from the French. The legendary Irish politician, Frank Hanley, was a devoted lieutenant.
The best way I can describe him is this way. He was a very lonely man. And one Saturday, the city hall was closed. He was in his office. So he'd phone me, say, Frank, I want you to take me for a drive to Lakeshore. I'm alone here. So, okay, I'd go down and knock on his door, and here I'd find him in his shorts. Ha! And I started to laugh. Ha! What an ugly beast he looked in his shorts. And of course he said to me, I said, Mr. Mayor, you look so ugly in your shorts. He said, you're not so handsome. So how do I describe him physically? Well, he was very ugly. Ha! Number one.
But despite his 350 pounds, he was light on his feet and always dressed for the occasion. At the height of his powers, his resplendent garments filled 3 clothes closets in various parts of his city. Camillien Houde was born in 1889 in a workers' district of Montreal. His 9 brothers and sisters all died as babies. His father died when he was 8. His mother wrapped newspapers, and he worked as a butcher's boy. He was paid $1 a week, kept a nickel for spending money, and turned the rest over to his mother to help pay for his education. He joined the Bank of Hochelaga as a clerk and quickly rose to the post of inspector. On Sunday afternoons on the rinks of Montreal, he courted an undertaker's daughter, and they were married in 1912. Two years later, in Vienna, the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria attended the funeral of his nephew, assassinated in Sarajevo. This assassination provided an excuse for the crowned heads of Europe to launch the First World War. No one had ever seen a war like this before. It would kill 10 million men for no apparent reason. Like much of French Canada, Camillien Houde considered this a useless exercise in European bloodletting and refused to volunteer. He shared the general revulsion in French Canada when the federal government, under the Conservatives, decided, with 60,000 Canadians already dead, to conscript men to fight in the trenches. This act had no effect on the war, but it destroyed the Conservative Party in Quebec. As the war ended, Houde suffered a personal tragedy when his young wife died in the great flu epidemic. His second wife was a shrewd and ambitious woman who thought that her husband was too intelligent to work out his life in a bank. Houde proceeded to fail miserably as a salesman, a biscuit maker, and a candy merchant. He went into the coal business, but his coal turned to dust. He tried to glue it back together again and sell it as coal balls. This was not successful. The Conservative Party of Quebec seemed like an ideal choice for a born loser.
Conservative Party at that moment was subjugated to the Liberal Party. It was only an opposition in name. It was not really an opposition.
How is that possible?
Well, it is possible that you know that the Conservatives were very unpopular in Quebec after the First War. So in order to get one Conservative elected in Quebec, the Liberals had to say yes. Otherwise, he would not have been elected.
In other words, the Conservative leader was elected by permission of the Liberals?
By permission of the Liberals.
Houde went to a meeting and found himself nominated as a Conservative candidate in the provincial election of 1923. He ran, as he said, mainly to keep warm, but to his astonishment, he was elected. He decided to run again, this time as mayor of Montreal. And to everyone's astonishment, he was once again elected. In 5 years, he had elevated himself from an abysmal coal merchant to a seat in the provincial legislature and the throne of the mayor of Montreal. 1928 was a good year to be the mayor of a wide-open city. It was an especially good year to be elected the mayor of a city near the American border. The United States was in the grip of the Great Prohibition. At the nearby Vermont frontier, the Canadian bootleggers were doing their best to go to the aid of the American drinking man. But American border officials went to even greater lengths to keep the Republic dry. The only thing to do was to come to Montreal, where the government inspected the whiskey to make sure it was fit for human consumption, and then sold it in unlimited quantities. If the human fly wanted to climb up on his city hall, Camillien Houde was happy to oblige. Everyone was permitted to enjoy himself in his own way. And Mayor Houde, who was living on a diet of gin and milk, was enjoying himself hugely. When they opened an airmail service from St. Hubert's Airport, Houde mailed a bear cub to Mayor Jimmy Walker of New York. Fearing that Walker might be dying of thirst, he stashed 3 bottles of Canadian booze in with the bear. In the quieter confines of Quebec City, Houde had been ejected from the legislature for calling Premier Taschereau a liar, and had been photographed in front of the Chateau Frontenac Hotel wearing nothing but his underwear, his chain of office, and a glass of gin. Despite these activities, or perhaps because of them, his party decided that he was the dynamic conservative champion who could unseat the entrenched but rapidly decaying liberal regime.
Oh, it was an absolute dictatorship. For example, at that moment, if the Attorney General fell in love with your wife, he just had you one night picked up, brought to Bordeaux, and no court, no writ could take you out of Bordeaux until the Attorney General was through with your wife.
Premier Taschereau had a lot of explaining to do. Although personally he was a patrician and beyond reproach, his regime, by all accounts, was rotten to the core. Several members of his administration were making considerable sums of money in highly dubious undertakings. In 1931, Houde led his party against Taschereau in a provincial election, and it looked like Houde would not only be the mayor of Montreal, but the Prime Minister of Quebec. Fortified with a sense of his political omnipotence, coupled with generous helpings of gin, Houde went to the attack with such vitriolic vigor that Taschereau had no difficulty in convincing the electorate that Houde was a demagogue of dangerous proportions. Houde felt that he had been stabbed in the back by some members of his own party, most particularly the member for Three Rivers, Maurice Duplessis. Duplessis argued that Quebec needed a dignified leader and that Houde did not fit that requirement. In 1932, Houde was kicked out as mayor of Montreal, and a few months later he was forced to resign the leadership of the Conservative Party. It came as no surprise when he was replaced by Maurice Duplessis. At the age of 43, Camillien Houde joined the growing ranks of the unemployed. In the midst of the Great Depression, fully a quarter of the population of Montreal was out of work, and the poorest of them were dying of starvation and tuberculosis. The people were looking for extreme solutions and for scapegoats. A dynamic new leader, Adrien Arcand, provided both. The solution was fascism, and the scapegoat was the Jew. Arcand's three newspapers preached a virulent anti-Semitism, but he was not alone. The St. Jean-Baptiste Society was openly anti-Semitic, and the respected journal Le Devoir took a strong anti-Jewish position. Camillien Houde was also taking a dubious view of the democratic process. His hero, however, was not the racist Hitler, but the more acceptable fascist, Mussolini of Italy. Houde helped to form the Grey Shirt movement. His partner was the fascist, Urtel Larocque.
Houde was the supreme chief of the Federation. I was the leader under Houde. So we knew that we had very little chance by an election. And we knew that the government was weak. And we knew that we could transport to Quebec enough men to get to the Parliament, surprise all those old men, and take power without even showing a gun or anything like that.
And that was your idea?
Surely, yes. Yes.
And did Houde go along with it?
At first, oh yes, we spent nights discussing the plan. All that we waited for was for Houde to say, we go.
And?
Well, he never did, because deep down, Houde was a man of order. And he knew that a move like that might start a revolution which he might not have been able to stop.
In 1934, Houde decided to try a comeback in more conventional politics. He swore off drinking and ran again for mayor of Montreal.
Every newspaper was against him. Every newspaper in Montreal predicted his defeat, said this clown will never come back.
The clown, who never took another drink in his life, had come back. He was mayor of Montreal again, with an unprecedented majority, but the gay days were gone. He now faced the awesome responsibility of trying to cope with the Depression. He had already repudiated Adrien Arcand and the fascist newspapers which had been supporting him. His worst enemies never accused him of being a racist, and he had always retained a warm relationship with the Jewish community. His secretary was the late Ted Bullock.
Houde had a very great heart. Houde came from a poor family. Nothing tortured Houde as much as the knowledge of the misery and suffering there were in this city. This is so true that I remember one day we went down to the city hall in the morning, though I rarely went with him. It was payday, and Houde cashed his check as mayor, was $800 and some, went up to the office and received a delegation of unemployed women who were crying and saying they were being thrown out of their houses, they had no money to feed their kids. Houde says it takes time to arrange these things through government. What you need is money, isn't it? And he took his money out of his pocket and he gave it to them and he said, divide this among yourselves. He said, it's all I can do today. And I came back here to the Mount Royal, and around 8 o'clock at night the phone rang. It was Houde, and he was laughing. He said, I've just had dinner down at the Traymore and I've got no money to pay for it. Will you come down and fish me out?
Finally, he had to stop seeing delegations. Houde went into a deep personal depression. He was often found weeping in his office. But he and his family tried to set an example, handing out food and clothing to the beggars and trying to broadcast good cheer to the people.
And we had it tough. And Camillien was getting a little hot because we were not getting enough money, 8 cents an hour in your welfare. So he went down to St. James Street and he said, I want money for my poor people. We have a depression. And the bank says, you have no collateral, we can't give you a loan. Houde said, if you don't give me money for my people, I'll turn them loose and they'll break your vaults and they'll take your money. And the banks agreed to give Houde money to feed his people. This was Camillien Houde. Who wouldn't love a guy like that?
He instituted a series of public works: the Atwater Market, the Botanical Gardens, the Mount Royal Lookout, the St. Helens Island development. These not only gave men work, but created green areas where they could go with their families. The mayor and the city council were on their own. The federal and provincial governments refused to come to the aid of the cities, claiming that the care and feeding of the poor was a civic responsibility. Houde instituted desperate stopgap measures, such as a rotational work system, wherein the jobs would be spread around.
What was Houde like in City Hall?
Well, first of all, in an executive committee meeting, we'll say J.O. Asselin was at, the late J.O. Asselin was at one end and Houde was at the other. So Houde would be one of his reports would come up and Asselin would say, no, we're not ready for that. Houde say, what? I want that report passed today. While he was snoring and sleeping, he still knew what was going on. See? Now in the council, when he wanted some of his reports passed, he put on his act. He started to swing his arms, got close to a desk and knocked over a glass of water, and he frightened the council to such an extent that they wouldn't, that's when we had the C-class, the nominated group. They were so frightened they wouldn't dare vote against any of Houde's report.
The affairs of the city were keeping Houde busy for 16 hours a day. His house was full of children, and he couldn't get much done. One night he took a suite in the Mount Royal Hotel. He liked it so much, he stayed there for the rest of his life.
He didn't want to disturb people, like the room clerk at the Mount Royal. Like, he never checked in, and he never checked out. So they had no record. Didn't cost him a dime in all the years he lived at the Mount Royal. That's because he didn't want to disturb the room clerk, you see.
Many thought he was estranged from his family, but this was not the case. Like the rest of them, his daughter Madeline accepted the unorthodox arrangement.
If we had a good pork roast, he would show up, you see. Mother would call him up and say, Dad, I've got something good to eat, you see. Then he really enjoyed himself coming home for that period of time. But you have to figure that when he gets up in the morning, he had to attend most of the time a funeral. Because in those days, we had about 18 districts in the city of Montreal, and each alderman knew almost everybody. And going to a funeral in those days meant striped suits with the top hat and everything.
But Houde did more for his constituents than attend their funerals. In 1935, he led the Conference of Canadian Mayors to Ottawa. The cities were rapidly going bankrupt. Houde and the other mayors accused the federal and provincial governments of hiding behind the Constitution and shamed them into coming to the financial aid of the municipalities. Houde much preferred the company of mayors to that of prime ministers. Convivial souls like Jerry McGeer of Vancouver shared Houde's love of pomp, circumstance, and distinguished visitors. McGeer's big catch of 1936 was the Lord Mayor of London, and he offered to share him with Houde. Senator Carl Goldenberg witnessed the negotiations.
Jerry McGeer said, "Camille, for $25,000, you can have the Lord Mayor of London for a night and a morning." And Houde said, "But Jerry, we're broke. I can't afford it. I'll give you $15,000. And McGeer said, "I can get $25,000 from Toronto." So Houde said, "I'll have to think it over. I don't know what I can do." Now, this is the story. The city of Vancouver was broke then. Jerry McGeer was quite an erratic fellow. He had accepted an invitation from the Lord Mayor of London and went to London and was received as the Lord Mayor receives guests. And he felt that he had to invite the Lord Mayor for a visit to Vancouver. Well, when Jerry came back and told his council that he had invited the Lord Mayor and that the Lord Mayor is accompanied by the Lady Mayoress, his mace bearer, and 3 or 4 other city council in Vancouver refused to vote the money for expenses to be incurred. So Jerry went across Canada selling the Lord Mayor. And he offered him to Houde for $25,000. Houde ended up by agreeing to pay the $25,000, but unfortunately for him, the Lord Mayor came after Houde suddenly resigned. So Houde could not even preside at the city dinner. It was presided over by Alderman McKenna, the florist.
Houde had resigned because 2 of his prime political enemies, Mackenzie King and Maurice Duplessis, had come to power in Ottawa and Quebec. Houde felt that he couldn't do business with them and resigned for the good of the city. But he soon realized that being mayor was the only thing he knew how to do, and he was swept back into office. Houde was at the top of his form. He was made a member of the French Legion of Honor and a companion of the British Empire, and he played host to guests that were even bigger than the Lord Mayor of London.
The route through the city becomes a veritable King's Highway, 23 miles in length. 23 miles of enthusiastic, cheering humanity like this massing of 50,000 youngsters of French descent packed into Montreal's baseball stadium. Slowly the royal car makes the circuit of the field so that all may see and hail their king and queen. The supreme moment comes when they're met out on the balcony in full view of the vast throng that surges forward with a full-throated welcome that is deafening.
Sharing these great events with Houde was the Quebec historian Robert Rumilly.
When she went back to England, she said that Camillien was the man who most impressed her in Canada. And Camillien was that was repeated to him, of course, and he was very proud of it, because he was very far from being anti-British, and he was even a royalist. He was a royalist, and I remember he used to tell me, the Royal Mail, His Majesty's Service, that has another style than just United States Mail. See?
I used to come over quite often to the hotel there. He'd call me whenever mayors turned up, and if I wanted to phone on a private line, I'd go into his bedroom. And one day, in the bedroom, there was a picture of Mussolini and a medal which the Mussolini had sent him through the consul, framed. I was amused. About 2 or 3 weeks later, I went into that bedroom to use the phone again. There was no Mussolini picture, but at his bedside, the little table on which the telephone was, there was Karl Marx Das Kapital. So when I went back into the sitting room, I said, "You've certainly changed your politics, Mr. Mayor." So what do you mean? I said, "Where's Mussolini?" "Oh," he said, "he's no good." I said, "But you've got Karl Marx." He says, "That's where the people of Quebec are going now, and I want to know all about it."
Did he switch back?
Well, of course, he didn't have much in the way of political principles. He wanted to lead the crowd, and he thought the best way to lead the crowd was to follow them and what he thought their political views or tendencies were.
But Mussolini remained a special favorite, and this fact did not endear Hood to English Canada. His stand, however, was not that bizarre in the Quebec of 1939. It has been estimated that 90% of the large Italian community was pro-fascist, and the church in Quebec did nothing to discourage this. Socialism and communism were considered far greater evils. When the Second World War began that fall, Quebec was decidedly lukewarm about involvement in another European war. Propaganda movies to encourage recruitment were more subtle than the posters of the First War that generally featured the British bulldog snarling at his French subjects. But the memories of the bloody conscription crisis of 1917 were still vivid. Mackenzie King had promised that only volunteers would serve outside of Canadian territory. But when he introduced national registration and brought in movie cameras to prove that he and his cabinet had willingly registered, French Canada was not impressed. They saw this as the first step towards eventual conscription. In August 1940, Mayor Hood issued a statement announcing that he would refuse to obey the law and register. Tracy Luddington of the Montreal Gazette is felt to be the man who sent Hood to jail.
But it wasn't anything deliberate. Campbell Carroll was covering City Hall for the Gazette at the time, and I was city editor. And he called me on the phone and he said, "The mayor has just advised people not to sign up for the war. What do I do?" Well, I said, "Do you remember exactly what he said?" He said, "Yes." Well, I said, "Type it out and take it in, ask him to sign it." Oh, he said he won't sign it. I said, "He will. I know the man, and if it's what he said, he'll sign it." So Campbell went in, he signed it, Campbell brought it back to the office. I wrote a story, and it was on the front page of the Gazette in the early edition. The censor, Eddie McMahon, called me up, and he said, "You're going to have to take that story out of the paper." Now, the country was at war, and the censor was the boss. So I took it out. Now, Hanson was the leader of the Conservatives at the time. I called him in Ottawa, and he gave me his secretary's home phone number, and I called her, and I read the story to her over the phone. Hanson went into the House of Commons and read it into the record before the Liberals were smart enough to stop him. This made it public record.
Mackenzie King and his Quebec Lieutenant Ernest Lapointe decided Hood would have to go. King made the following notation in his diary of August 3rd.
At 1 o'clock, I brought up the matter in the cabinet. All present were virtually agreed that action be taken against Hood, and that immediately. Council then discussed whether Hood should be interned or dealt with by the courts. It was agreed that, if brought before court, he would be given the opportunity he wanted, namely, speechify, making a display, etc. It was felt that if he were interned at once, that would deprive him of this opportunity and would be most helpful in the end. It was agreed that the mounted police should take this action forthwith, It was thought it had better be taken at night, as there would be no opportunity for photograph displays, etc. I can see in this whole business possibility of riots and serious difficulties throughout the province of Quebec. However, I see no other course. The federal government cannot afford to have its laws defied by one of Mayor Houde's prominence.
Montrealers read that their mayor had been arrested at 11 o'clock the night before while on the steps of City Hall. But Mackenzie King had nothing to fear. There was little outcry.
Now, when he was interned during that period,
Houde had been a favorite target of the entertainer Gratien Gélinas.
did you at that time continue to do anything on Houde?
No, because it would have been, the audience would not have found it funny. He was there, you see, and I think that the audience felt, the public felt a little ashamed of their lack of reactions when he was interned. I'm quite sure that Camillien Houde himself thought that there would be an uproar, you see, if they would try to put him away, and nothing happened.
The mayor was a forgotten man. He was taken first to Petawawa internment camp and then to Fredericton. At Petawawa, the leader of the prisoners was Mario Latoni.
I was the first one to know of any new arrivals, and I was told that, lo and behold, the mayor of Montreal had arrived to become part of the family at the Petawawa internment camp. Unfortunately, he could not be received within the compound the same day that he arrived, or shortly after, because we could not find a large enough uniform to fit him.
He was permitted only one postcard a month, and that was censored. His family was not allowed to see him for a year and a half, and then only once a month for 20 minutes. Another visitor was his secretary, Lucien Hétu.
Because when I went to Petawawa, I really had a shock. I had known Houde in his role of mayor of Montreal, and you come to him in that prisoner's uniform with a large red circle in the back, as he said, in case I run too fast, with his 300 pounds.
Although he was 51 years of age, he joined in with the work gangs. One winter, he cut so much wood, the authorities finally had to order him to stop. He refereed hockey games and gave out no penalties, saying the players involved were in enough trouble already.
And he was a greater and a bigger Canadian than this guy to my left here. Right here. And that's why today you will see behind my home the Camillien Houde Memorial Ring. A salute to Camillien Houde. I could picture Camillien up in Petawawa saying, Jimmy and Joe, this is the way you do it. If we could be with our Montrealers tonight, if we were free to do things we might, then I could see him do a little soft shoe on the shoes. I want to go back to that tumble down shack in Montreal. I want to see all the gang that I used to know.
Now, he didn't hold this against me. He was in for 4 years, and every one of those years on my birthday, he sent me a birthday present. And every one of those 4 years on Christmas, he sent me a Christmas present. Because he knew something I didn't know. He realized that I had made him a martyr in his own lifetime.
In August 1944, with the defeat of fascism inevitable, Houde was placed on the Ocean Limited and given a ticket to Montreal. When they had taken him away 4 years earlier, the city had been silent, and Houde had every reason to believe that he had lost his audience.
You can organize 500 people to meet somewhere there, but you cannot do with thousands and thousands of people. It was partly organized, but it was a very sincere reaction of the mass. They loved him, and they wanted to see him. They felt lonesome about him, and he felt lonesome about them too.
The people were crying and calling at him, and everybody was so glad, so glad. You could see that, you know, your heart was jumping to hear something like that.
Of course, the scene was...
Another witness was the writer, David Leggett.
And it wasn't entirely French-Canadian by any means, because the man was, I think the word is loved. They knew he was a mischievous individual, but they loved the man.
The man was getting up in years. He was about 55 at the time. He had no position, no job, no business, no profession. There was only one thing he could do, and that was public life.
Within months, Houde was re-elected mayor, and from then to the end of his political career, no man could beat him, and few dared to try. He had taught himself English by reading newspapers, and he knew it so well that he could now deliberately misuse it to enrich his legend. When he was asked to build public urinals, he said he would not only build urinals, he would build arsenals. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the head of the Dutch resistance, may have disapproved of Houde's war effort, but he quickly succumbed to the warmth of the man. A warmth which penetrated even unto the English mansions of Westmount.
But my first really contact with his worship came at St. Andrew's Ball, because, you know, he'd been in an internment camp, and a lot of the old Scotchmen were a little against his appearing, and I fought very much for him. So did my husband. And he came to the ball, and he was great. He was absolutely wonderful.
Was there any tension at that first St. Andrew's Ball after the war?
I don't think so. Everybody was too busy getting a little high.
Houde was also quick to forgive. The Liberal cabinet had kept him in prison for 4 years. And yet when a Liberal cabinet minister like Paul Martin came to call, Houde was a gracious host.
He had the most amazing, ugly, kind-looking face. He had a great sense of humor. He said to the present queen when she was princess, they were driving through the streets of Montreal on Sherbrooke Street, presumably, in an open automobile. People on both sides of the street were crowded, were 4 and 5 feet deep, cheering like hell. And he turned to the princess and he said, "Your Royal Highness, some of that's for you."
Houde was not a beloved figure in the rest of Canada. Toronto Star cameramen were ordered to photograph him in the most unflattering manner possible. This, of course, delighted Houde, who said that the more outlandish he looked, the more his people would love him. Many of his female constituents seemed to feel that Camille was so ugly, he was beautiful.
He liked the women. Oh, he really loved the women. He couldn't get away from that. And I seen him with some very nice women, some other women who weren't too good looking, but he didn't care. As long as he was in their company, he was happy.
The one man who had had the last laugh on Houde was the Iron Man of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis. In 1933, Duplessis had driven him from the larger provincial stage, and Houde had never forgotten. But now it was 1949, and the two leaders of French Canada were brought together on neutral territory and left alone in a hotel room. They emerged 3 hours later, swapping traveling salesman jokes, and Duplessis had agreed to support Houde in a run for a seat in the Canadian House of Commons. Houde won the election and went to Ottawa. They built a special seat large enough to hold the new member from Montreal. He was sworn in on a hot August day, but he told friends later that he felt as if the chamber was made of ice.
I saw him in Parliament, but I think I only saw him there once or twice. He never spoke, and he only came for two, three times, and he never returned. What happened, I don't know. I think he just lost interest. I think he realized that it was likely a forum not suited to his interests or skills.
He went home to stay. Post-war Montreal was tailor-made for Camillien Houde.
What made the 40s so spectacular?
Oh, I think there was a real feeling that there was no tomorrow, you know. There was no feeling of, there was a lot of money around and people were spending it. It came easy and they spent it easy. There was a lot of war profiteering there, and also there was a lot of money from guys in the army, young
Ken Johnson, journalist and man about town, covered the nightclubs for the old Montreal Standard.
And of course the gamblers, they say they were spending their money in the clubs. And certainly was a wild kind of city.
At the Windsor Steakhouse and the Penthouse, 28 years in all. 28 years. But I think for the first 2-3 years I didn't have a permit, but I was selling booze anyway.
Harry Labe ran a club so popular that entertainers like Dean Martin would come in after hours and work for nothing.
Selling without a license? Well, you take a chance. We used to get pinched, and we used to all go down. There used to be a thrill to go down the patrol. Everybody used to make the reservations in the patrol then. They wanted the front seat. There was a lineup of cops as you walked down the staircase up, and they walked you into the paddy wagon, and then we'd take a deck of cards with us, and Harry start playing for money down in the cells, and they'd gamble, and when they'd say, okay, you're all out. He says, no, we're not finished yet. They wouldn't believe
Did you have to pick up?
Oh, yeah, we had to bail them out. It was like $50, and then you'd get one of the cops with one finger. You sit there 4 hours while he was typing with one finger.
But the police were generally friendly and helpful. The downtown area, where the Barbot gambling palaces abounded, was the province of Detective Sergeant Fred Savage.
In number 10 district, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We had about a dozen Barbots, and they were all wide open. We had our gambling, we had our houses for these ladies, we had hockey tickets and betting and everything. And everybody was so happy. And everybody lived like a human being should live.
Let's say that the city was lively and open. Like if you were arrested at 3 a.m. after you spent part of your paycheck and all the money went back to the governments in taxes, you were put in jail until you sobered. Let them out and let them go home and let the wife pronounce sentence, you see?
From time to time, the police came out in force to reassure the citizens that everything was in good working order.
When they were going to raid certain places, the police told them they were coming. So they'd leave new customers in the place, and all their very good customers, they'd get them out fast. So when the police got there, they got about 4 or 5 prisoners. But the raid was made, which they had to do to make a showing.
The bartenders, the club owners, the politicians still remember the good old days. George Gould was an attorney for the city.
You can't raid the golf clubs where the biggest gambling going on in this whole country was going on there. The private clubs, such as the Montreal Club in the corner of Stanley and Sherbrooke. Beautiful big club opposite Sir William Van Horn's house. How could you raid that legally and get a conviction? There's more gambling going on than what these gentlemen are talking about.
But the city's attitude then was one of tolerance?
Tolerance. There's no way. The province would not allow us to change the law to allow it, which is the case now.
And this is what I've learned from the late Camillien Houde. You've got to be honest with people, Frank. If they're taking bets, it's not murder, it's not assassination. It's not criminal, it's against a minor bylaw.
And another thing, these girls, who we call prostitutes, they were allowed to roam free. Well, we never had any rapes with these women roaming around, because a person might have family trouble, he might be a maniac or something, he goes downtown and he's got his satisfaction, and he doesn't bother anybody.
There were others in the city who did not entirely agree with Fred Savage. Even Houde's sidekick, Frank Hanley, sometimes had to draw the line.
In my heart, I couldn't go for legalized prostitution because of Catholicity. So I had to decide between common sense and Catholicity, and I decided on Catholicity. I'm not an atheist, and when I die, I want to be all dressed up and I want to have somewhere to go.
Everybody had somewhere to go. One of the arguments for keeping the gambling joints going was that they provided the criminal element with a place to spend their money. When a job was pulled, the police didn't have far to look.
40 to 60, little or no bank holdups. Rapes, breaking in and entries, little or none. Because the guy with a record had a job in a nightclub, in a tavern, as a doorman. He didn't have to go out with the pistol after he was released from St. Vincent Paul or Bordeaux. So it's another way of administering a city, and this was Houde's way.
It got rough later on. It got rough when the pressure started to move in on these people. I think the chap who sort of was the edge man, you know, the edge man was the guy who was supposed to fix City Hall and fix the police. Well, this one particular edge man went a little berserk and started to shoot the town up, and the information that I got was that he's in one of the piers of the Champlain Bridge.
This day?
They put him away because he was dangerous.
What do you mean he's in the pier?
He was put in when they were pouring the concrete, he went in there. He's still in there.
Building people into bridges was one thing, but one summer day in 1946, a small-time Houde called Lou Berkowitz committed an indiscretion which brought an outcry from the general population. Harry Davis, an underworld kingpin, was found with a hole in his head.
Harry Davis, who was then the edge man, he was the one who said who ran what, let the word out that Berkowitz could not open. And Berkowitz was desperate, and he did open. So then the word got back to Berkowitz that someone was going to be looking for him. So he went to talk to Harry Davis. And after he talked to Harry Davis was dead.
Oh, Camillien Houde was one of the best.
The sudden departure of Harry Davis caused an outburst of silence in some quarters. Even Kid Obley, who was known as the mayor of Peel and St. Catherine and was alleged to know what everybody was up to, maintains an attitude of discretion to this day.
Do me a favor.
Somebody told me then there was a lot of gambling and stuff like that in the city.
Never. Never. Town was always closed.
Montreal was always closed?
Always closed.
Wasn't a wide open city?
Was not a wide open city.
I thought there was a lot of rackets and that sort of thing.
I never heard about that. I never heard any rackets. It's all propaganda.
All of it?
Yeah.
Come on, kid.
Well, 99% propaganda.
How much?
99%.
Not 99.
I would say 99. You hear people talk, they yak about this and about that. They're full of crap. They don't know what they're talking about. People are jealous and they make up stories. The town was closed.
Kid, town was wide open.
Well, not that I know. I must have been in a coma. I don't.
But others were talking incessantly to a pair of hard-hitting investigators who were brought in to launch a full-scale probe into crime and corruption. They were Pax Plant and a young lawyer named Jean Drapeau.
Oh, he said, Frank, they're amateurs. Let's not take them serious. But they got the right judge on their side. I said, Mr. Mayor, you should take amateurs very serious at times. He said, no way. So he was very careless. Otherwise, he has so much power. First of all, it would not be a probe. And they would not have taken over the city, because they had in mind not the question. In which way of thinking? Not the question of morality. They had in mind of taking over the city, but he didn't think they were big enough to take it. And I said, be careful.
He underestimated them.
That's right, and he was not careful, and he lost his city. This was Hood City.
33 of his police officers were fired. Many of his councillors were implicated. And there was evidence that political patronage was rampant. But there was absolutely no evidence that Camillien Houde was personally involved. George Marler, a distinguished member of the Quebec establishment, had served on Houde's city council.
I think this was part of the political system that had developed up to that time. I think I would be the last to suggest that Houde had invented it, or even that he had perfected it. I think there were people before him who left the city with a reputation which was far less enviable than that of Camillien Houde.
In 1954, after 370 sessions, the vice probe was finished. If Houde himself was cleared, he was saddened to see the extent of the corruption in his administration.
And yet, you know, Mr. Montreal was a sort of a Pagliacci. You remember, Rini Pagliacci. And it made him very endearing. And if Houde was a broken-hearted man who laughed to hide his hurts, is that not perhaps a reflection on his greatness as a politician? But it's no reflection on his greatness as a human being and as a man.
Despite the scandal, there was a reluctance on the part of local politicians to try and run against Houde. He cleared the way by announcing his resignation.
And he had told me, he said, one way or the other, an actor has to be as elegant when going out of stage as when coming on. So he said, I don't want to be defeated. My health is no more what it was, and I want to be replaced.
He did vegetate. I think he felt that he would have been given something to do, like being the official greeter for the city, and Mayor Drapeau didn't give it to him. He certainly didn't want to go to the Senate I know he was offered that, and I know Mr. Duplessis offered him a seat in the upper house. I was there when it was offered to him, and he turned it down.
Not only did he no longer have his city hall, he had very little else. He had to auction off his personal belongings to support his wife, who had suffered brain damage and could no longer even remember the days of glory. Now he walked with her through the green areas he had developed with the little people of Montreal in the days of the Great Depression. He always said he had one more speech to give, but he never did.
It was so funny. And I felt sorry when he died.
And then when the day come when we lost our most wonderful mayor, the day of the funeral, I seen men, big men, as strong as I am, and women crying because they knew that that man had a heart.
A 100,000 people attended the funeral. It was the largest in Montreal since the death of Brother Andre. The thing that many of them remembered best that day were the times when he had raised his voice to lead them all in song.
À la claire fontaine, m'en allant promener. À la claire fontaine, m'en allant promener. J'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baigné. Il y a longtemps que je t'aime.